the 26th of January 1808, in the fledgling British colony of New South Wales in Australia, 400 soldiers of His Majesty's New South Wales Corps marched on Government House in Sydney, their band playing the British Grenadiers. And there, they arrested the King's appointed governor and installed their own military government. The Rum Rebellion is the only successful armed coup d'etat in Australian history. But what was it all about? Was a coup really inspired by alcohol? And how did William Bligh end up facing a second mutiny in his career? When the First Fleet arrived in Australia in January 1788, it brought approximately 1,400 souls, including 750 convicts guarded by Royal Marines, to establish Britain's newest penal colony. The settlers, including the convicts, faced immense challenges: harsh physical conditions, isolation from Britain by 6 months sailing, and critically, virtually no currency. Without coin or paper money, the colony developed a barter system based on goods, particularly rum and other spirits. In 1789, the New South Wales Corps was formed to replace the Marines. Now, we've come across the New South Wales Corps before in my episode about the Castle Hill convict rising. You might recall that unlike regular British Army regiments, the Corps was recruited mainly from long-serving soldiers solely to serve in Australia, guarding the convicts. The Corps arrived with the Second Fleet in June 1790. Under Major Francis Grose, the officers, and there were about 70 commissioned to the Corps in a 20-year period, received generous land grants and were assigned convict labour. And they had access to ships for importing goods, not least rum. In a barter economy, rum became the de facto currency, and those who controlled the rum controlled the economy and controlled the colony. The officers gained huge wealth and influence, and the Corps gained the local nickname, the Rum Corps. One officer who arrived with the Corps on the Second Fleet in June 1790 was Lieutenant John Macarthur. Born in 1767, Macarthur, accompanied by his wife Elizabeth, was ambitious, capable, and combative. Like other officers, he received a land grant, in his case at Parramatta in 1793, naming it Elizabeth Farm, in honour of his wife. When the first merino sheep arrived in 1797, Macarthur recognised what others missed. Australia's climate was perfect for producing high-quality wool to compete with European supplies. But Macarthur's personality also made enemies. He clashed with every governor he served under, refusing to return rum taken from stores under Governor Phillip, and sending complaints directly to London about his successor, Governor Hunter, contributing to his recall. Under the third governor, Governor King, tensions escalated. In September 1801, Macarthur actually fought a duel with his own commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Patterson, shooting him in the shoulder. Governor King sent Macarthur back to England for court-martial. Macarthur, however, turned this potential career disaster into a personal and financial triumph. Due to no witnesses travelling all the way from Australia, his court-martial fell apart. And then he convinced the British government that he could establish a successful wool industry in Australia. In October 1804, Lord Camden, Secretary of State for War and the Colonies, keen to break the army's reliance on Spanish wool for its uniforms, ordered Governor King to grant Macarthur 5,000 acres at the cow pastures, the colony's finest land, with another 5,000 acres promised if successful. And thus Macarthur returned to New South Wales in 1805, resigned his commission, and focused on commerce. Nevertheless, he maintained close ties with the Corps officers through both business partnerships and shared interests. However, despite Lord Camden's order, Governor King said that Macarthur's land grant was provisional, and that decision would become a weapon for the next governor. And that governor, who arrived in August 1806, was none other than Commodore William Bligh, he of Mutiny on the Bounty fame. Now, I talked about that particular event in a recent episode. Following the mutiny, Bligh was cleared of any wrongdoing by the Admiralty, and his career flourished. Now here he was as the 4th Governor of New South Wales. He arrived with very clear orders from London: break the Rum Corps' stranglehold on the colony. Swiftly, Bligh cracked down on the rum trade. He introduced strict port regulations. He questioned land grants, which seemed to only enrich those at the top of the pile. He appointed civilian magistrates to assert civil authority, and he tried to break the monopolies enjoyed by those powerful few, including, of course, the officers of the New South Wales Corps. All of which made him very popular with many of the free settlers, but not with the officers in the Corps, who saw this as an attack on their wealth. So too did former officers who had also benefited from the system, none more so than John Macarthur. The former officer turned businessman became a bitter enemy of Bligh. The feeling was mutual, and Bligh now refused to confirm Macarthur's provisional land grant. By 1807, the colony was dangerously polarised. Confrontation, nevertheless, was inevitable. It just needed a spark. And here it comes. At the time, all ship owners had to put up a bond, effectively a cash deposit, which was forfeit should they assist a convict escape the colony. In June 1807, a convict duly stowed away on a ship, owned by, yes, you've guessed it, Macarthur, who was ordered to appear before Judge Advocate Richard Adkins and forfeit his bond. True to form, Macarthur refused to do so, and so on the 25th of January 1808 he was put on trial. Undaunted, he immediately objected to Adkins serving as judge, claiming that Adkins owed him money, which was actually true. And 6 New South Wales Corps officers serving on the jury sided with him and refused to recognise the court's authority. Bligh was furious. Who was running the colony? The governor and the civil administration? Or a group of officers? Well, he was about to find out. The next morning, the 26th of January 1808, Bligh ordered Macarthur's rearrest and threatened to charge the 6 officers with either mutiny or even treason. Facing the end of their careers, financial ruin and possibly worse, the officers went to their commanding officer, Major George Johnston. Born in Annandale, Scotland in 1764, he received a Marine lieutenancy at the age of 12, secured by his father's patron. He then served in New York during the American War of Independence and the East Indies against the French, where he was severely wounded. He volunteered for the First Fleet and was reportedly the very first man ashore at Port Jackson in January 1788, and he immediately joined the New South Wales Corps when it was formed. Since then, Johnston, like other officers, had accumulated substantial land grants. He also accumulated 7 children with Esther Abrahams, a Jewish convict he had established a relationship with back in 1787. In March 1804, Johnston demonstrated his military competence when Irish convicts staged a major uprising at Castle Hill. Now, as I said earlier, I've covered this event in a previous episode. Suffice to say, Johnston captured the rebel leaders whilst negotiating under a flag of truce, and then went on to crush the rebellion. By 1808, Johnston commanded the Corps in Sydney, whilst the actual overall Corps commander, Lieutenant Colonel Patterson, he who was wounded in the duel, was absent in Tasmania, or Van Diemen's Land as it was called at the time. Now facing his fellow officers, the 44-year-old knew exactly what to do. At approximately 6 o'clock in the evening, on the 26th of January 1808, Major George Johnston gave the order to march on Government House. 400 soldiers of the New South Wales Corps marched through Sydney, accompanied by their band, playing the British Grenadiers. Upon their arrival, Johnston demanded Bligh's surrender. What happened next became disputed. Popular legend claims Bligh was found hiding under a bed, a story that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Historians actually debate whether this was true or just rebel propaganda. What certainly is true is that Bligh did not immediately surrender. He apparently attempted to delay or even avoid arrest, though whether this constituted hiding under a bed remains unclear. What was also certain, the army had taken control. It remains the only coup in Australia's history. And remarkably, it was bloodless. No shots fired, no one injured. Bligh was treated with formal military courtesy once taken into custody. The rebellion succeeded entirely through the threat of force, rather than its application. On that same evening, Johnston issued proclamations, declaring himself Lieutenant Governor. He explained that Bligh had exceeded his authority, indeed his threats to arrest the officers for treason proving that he was despotic, and that this action was necessary to preserve order. Crucially, he pledged loyalty to King George III, and the British flag continued to fly throughout the rebellion. The next day, Johnston appointed John Macarthur as colonial secretary. The man whose trial had triggered the crisis now effectively ran the colonial administration of the colony. Meanwhile, Bligh was placed under house arrest at Government House. Johnston actually hoped he would voluntarily return to England, which would have simplified everything. Bligh, being Bligh, adamantly refused to do so. He insisted that he remained the lawful governor. To leave voluntarily would acknowledge the legitimacy of his removal. More strategically, Bligh understood that if he returned to England as a deposed governor, his version of events might be dismissed. By remaining, he not only avoided that, but he kept the constitutional crisis active and in the minds of the authorities in London. For over a year, this extraordinary situation continued. Johnston governed with Macarthur as his chief advisor. Bligh remained under house arrest, claiming legitimate authority. Both sides prepared documents which they sent to London. In March 1809, Bligh agreed to sail to England, but in characteristic fashion, he didn't go directly home. In fact, he diverted to Hobart in Tasmania, Van Diemen's Land, attempting to rally support and maintain a base of authority close to Sydney. His efforts, however, achieved little. He lacked the military force to challenge Johnston. News of the rebellion finally reached London in mid-1808, arriving 6 months after the event. The British government was shocked and outraged. However, with communications between London and New South Wales taking 6 months in each direction, it was nearly a year before the government finally came to the conclusion that Johnston and Macarthur wouldn't and couldn't be dislodged locally. Finally, in May 1809, the British government appointed Major General Lachlan Macquarie as the new governor. He departed England later that month with instructions to restore civil administration. He was accompanied by the 73rd Regiment of Foot. The 73rd was a regular British Army regiment with a distinguished combat record. In the previous decade, they had fought in India in the Fourth Anglo-Mysore War, participating in the siege of Seringapatam in 1799, one of the great battles that broke Tipu Sultan's power in India. For 3 months, British forces besieged his fortress capital, and when the walls were breached, British and East India Company troops stormed through, fighting room to room. Tipu died defending his palace. It was a brutal, professional military operation that tested every soldier. Macquarie himself had also fought in this battle, and for Bernard Cornwell fans, so too did Richard Sharp. By the way, I'm going to tell the story of that battle very soon, so keep your eyes peeled for it. Following that campaign, the 73rd spent the next decade fighting in both India and Ceylon. The contrast with the New South Wales Corps was stark and obvious to everyone. Whilst they were both similar in actual numbers, just over 400 men from the 73rd were accompanying the new governor, there was no doubting which regiment was the battle-hardened, battle-ready unit. In the last 10 years, the 73rd had fought in India and Ceylon, including the bloody battle at Seringapatam against the fearless Tipu Sultan. And meanwhile, the Rum Corps had fought a brief battle with poorly armed convicts. Macquarie arrived at Sydney Cove on the 28th of December 1809. The 73rd Regiment formed up in full military array, a clear demonstration of their power. Johnston recognised the futility of any sort of resistance, and he submitted to Macquarie's authority. On the 1st of January 1810, Macquarie proclaimed the rebellion illegal. 4 days later, he voided all land grants and appointments made during the rebellion, though he did later review some of these case by case. The New South Wales Corps, which had actually been renamed the 102nd Regiment of Foot in 1808, formally acknowledged Macquarie's authority. They embarked for England in May 1810, effectively ending the military basis for the rebellion. They subsequently served in the War of 1812 under Charles Napier, whom we've met in my episodes about the Anglo-Sikh Wars, before being disbanded in 1818. George Johnston also sailed for England in May 1810 to face a high-profile court-martial for mutiny. His defence argued that Bligh had governed tyrannically, exceeding his lawful authority. The colony faced immediate chaos without intervention. Johnston had acted reluctantly only after his fellow officers appealed to him. They pointed to the bloodless nature of events that demonstrated his restraint, and maintained that he'd remained loyal to the Crown. Despite his robust defence, Johnston was found guilty of mutiny, a crime that carried the death penalty. Indeed, the death penalty for mutiny in the British Army was only abolished in 1998, although the last man actually executed was back in 1920. However, that sentence was not always carried out, and Johnston is a case in point. Instead of execution, the major was cashiered, in other words dismissed from military service. The lenient punishment probably reflected sympathy for his claims about Bligh, recognition for his long service record including combat wounds, and the bloodless nature of events. Bligh too had sailed to London, and once again, just like after the Bounty Mutiny, he was officially exonerated. The government declared his removal unlawful and accepted his version of events. However, despite vindication, Bligh never returned to New South Wales and received no further colonial appointments. He instead returned to naval service, rising to Vice Admiral in 1814, before dying in London in 1817 at the age of 63, never fully escaping the shadow of 2 mutinies. Johnston remarkably did return to New South Wales in 1813 as a private citizen. Macquarie pragmatically allowed it. He and Esther finally married in 1814, legitimising their relationship of 27 years, and their family prospered in Australian society. Johnston then lived peacefully on his estates at Annandale until his death in 1823. John Macarthur's situation was more ambiguous. As a civilian who hadn't led the military action, legal grounds for prosecution were a bit unclear. He sailed to England in 1809 to clear his name, staying until 1817, whilst using political connections to protect himself. During his absence, his wife Elizabeth ran and built their sheep business. By the 1820s, wool, largely thanks to her efforts, had become the colony's primary export. Macarthur was finally allowed to return, and he died at his estate at Cow Pastures, which he had renamed Camden Park in honour of the Colonial Secretary in 1834. A very wealthy man, thanks to wool, not rum. Ironically, the rebellion accelerated the reforms that it actually opposed. Macquarie's administration from 1810 to 1821 transformed New South Wales. He established the legitimate governance that Bligh had attempted, introducing proper currency, ending the rum-based barter system, establishing trade regulations, and initiating a massive public building programme that transformed Sydney. Which leaves one final question. Why was this rebellion called the Rum Rebellion, when rum itself played little part in it? Well, it's a bit of a misnomer. Interestingly, at the time, it was actually called the Great Rebellion. But in 1855, English Quaker William Howitt, wrote a popular history of Australia. A teetotaler, Howitt was swift to blame alcohol for all the problems in the world, and the Rum Corps' central role in the rebellion was too good to miss. He renamed the rebellion the Rum Rebellion, and the name stuck. And that Rum Rebellion remains Australia's only coup d'etat, a bloodless replacement of the King's Governor by a British regiment, claiming not a blow for independence, but preservation of British traditions in New South Wales. It's strange how history weaves its thread. Well, I hope you enjoyed that story that fuses British military history with the history of early Australia. And if you did, then why not check out my story about the Castle Hill Revolt or Bligh's first mutiny on the Bounty? Don't forget the Battle of Seringapatam coming very soon. Thanks for joining me today. Keep well, and I look forward to sharing even more forgotten stories from British history with you very soon.